Well, greetings, and I hope that your solitary confinement has been tolerable for you over the last couple of weeks. I'm going to talk today about what we're going to do for our next exercise, which involves NoSQL. And here we see the calendar of events that are coming up over the next few weeks. And as you can see, we're going to be working with this BI ethics discussion. I had talked about that and sent an announcement out about that earlier. And I see that several of you have already done your prep for the NoSQL exercises, so that's a good thing because we're going to be starting to do that shortly. And I have a few things that are SQL Server related things that I've pushed back later in the semester. We'll see what we're going to do with that, but let's not worry about those things just yet. And I did release all the quizzes. So you've got the one quiz having to do with OLAP and data mining, and another quiz having to do with text analytics and big data. A lot of the stuff for both of these quizzes are covered in chapter 11 of the textbook, and of course I also have notes available in the modules. What I'm going to focus on today is the idea of NoSQL and what we're going to do with it in our upcoming exercise. And so if I go to the modules, and I can go to the NoSQL exercises. Now, I had given you this PowerPoint and gave you this assignment to do. Let's just kind of go quickly through it. You're going to be using AWS, and many of you probably have already had some experience with AWS. Certainly if you're a CIS major and you've taken CIS 301, you've had some experience with AWS, which is Amazon Web Services. And we're in particular going to be using DynamoDB, which is an example of what's called a document store database. And so we went through all of this process about how to set up your permissions policy, how to get your account on AWS. There's some configuration files and credentials files that you have to store, which I provided for you as well in the downloads. Looks like folks are mostly doing okay with getting that stuff done. Just to verify, however, if this is going to work for you, then you should be able to pull up Python, the Python shell, and do these three things, which is to import the package called Boto3, which you first need to install, and then also just to test it out to make sure that you can connect to your AWS account with the DynamoDB privileges. These two commands right here will help you to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and do that myself so you can see that I'm able to get it to work. Let me pull up Python idle. And if I just go to the shell, I should be able to import Boto3, which is a package that you would have installed. And then I'm going to be able to, and I'll just copy these over here. I have this command where I am invoking the Boto3 client specifically for DynamoDB, and I'm able to do that without any errors, and even able to list my tables. Now you won't see any tables yet unless you've already done the exercise, but I do see a table called AW product BOM, and it's based on that exact same JSON file that we had worked with before. As a matter of fact, let me see, I think I have it up in Notepad here. This JSON file here, and if I copy it, and I want to look at it in pretty print, which we've looked at as well before. Let me go to, I'll pull up pretty print. My favorite one is the JSON format or pretty print. And if I go ahead and paste it in here, you should see that we have this JSON where we have, these are the products in the AdventureWorks database, and you can see that we actually have a bill of materials, which we hadn't explored before, and that bill of materials is basically the idea is that you have a product and it might be made up of components, and those components might be made up of components. So here you can see there's a hierarchy here of components that themselves have subcomponents, and if you were to go to a bicycle, for example, you'd see a whole hierarchy in this bill of materials. And we're going to be working with that bill of materials in this exercise that we're going to do. So, given that hopefully you've been able to get that going, and this is going to be needed in order for you to do the upcoming exercise. Now let me go to the modules here, and for this lecture, for this video, I'm just going to focus on what is NoSQL all about. So here is the notes that I'm going to use for that. So NoSQL stands for not only SQL. It's become a very prevalent notion in this era of big data, and it's discussed in Chapter 11 of your textbook. And we're going to be making use of AWS's DynamoDB database, which is a commercial version, although for free, of what's called a document store database. And I'm also going to give you the opportunity to play around with the D3 visualization. In my story analyzer dashboards, there's lots of D3 visualizations, and so you'll be able to kind of play around with one. I'm not asking you to code any D3, but we'll be taking data that we get from doing a query and putting it into a D3 tree visualization. So what's NoSQL? Stands for not only SQL, so that doesn't mean that there is no SQL. It just means that that's not the only type of data storage that you can have. It's associated with big data, and here are some terms that go along with this notion of NoSQL. It's not really a great environment for the type of transaction processing that needs the high level of data integrity and ACID compliance that you have in a relational database, but for a lot of purposes, it's very, very useful. What do we mean by ACID compliance? This is something that if you wanted to read more about it in your textbook in Chapter 12, they talk about ACID compliance. And ACID means atomic, consistent, isolated, and durable. And the idea here is that if you have a transaction that might involve many, many updates, that you want to make sure that either the entire transaction completes or none of it completes. And imagine a scenario where maybe you had to do a bunch of updates for a transaction to take place, for example, a purchase order, for example. Well, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to make a new order record. You're going to have to make the order line records, these detail records for products that you're purchasing. Well, their inventory level is going to go down, so maybe you have to change that data. Maybe you're going to have in your customer record, you might have something about their account balance or something like that. So all of these updates have to take place, and imagine what would happen if halfway through all of a sudden the transaction aborted. What you want to make sure is that you're not going to have a transaction that's halfway complete. Perhaps you remember from your database class how you would have to commit before an update actually becomes permanent, and the alternative was to roll back. And so one of the things that relational database technology allows you to do is to make sure that you have atomic transactions. And these other terms, consistent, isolated, and durable, are also part of the ACID compliance that is needed for relational databases. You're not going to have that in many of these NoSQL environments. Another feature of the NoSQL environment is this notion of schema on read as opposed to schema on write. Now, what you're used to is schema on write, which means that when we designed the database, we specified all of the metadata for that database. We had required data types for all the fields. There was referential integrity constraints and domain constraints and metadata created before you even put data into the database. You have metadata that's created. The alternative to that is not to worry about metadata when it's created, to just throw a bunch of data into something that's often called a data lake. And this data could be JSON, it could be XML, it could be text files, it could be all kinds of different data files, and as well, could be SQL files as well, relational databases as well, but not solely that. We're going to specifically be using JSON. So you store it, and we don't worry about metadata at that point. The only time that we worry about metadata is when we want to use it. The data is stored, we just slap it in there, and then at the time of use is when we're going to apply our metadata to it. It's kind of similar to what we did in the SQL Server integration services, where we would have a text file, for example, and then based on what that text file's columns are, then we would go in and decide, well, this particular part of the text file is going to be a number, and that particular part of the text file is going to be a date, and etc. We don't worry about that when the text file was created. We worried about that when we were using it. And so this notion of schema on read as opposed to schema on write is something you're going to see a lot of when we're working in an NoSQL environment. The textbook indicates a variety of different types, And I will say that a lot of what we're going to encounter is this notion of keys and values, and you already encountered that in Python with dictionaries. A dictionary, if you want to get a particular object out of that dictionary, a particular item out of that dictionary, you give it a key, and then it gives you that item. And the same thing is true with JSON. So this notion of key-value pairs is something you've encountered before. Document store is a key-value pair, but the value in this case is a full-blown document. And in our case, it's going to be a JSON document. And then there's these other kinds. There's something called wide column stores. There's something else called graph-oriented databases. I might want to explore some of that later in the semester. Graph-oriented databases are very useful for artificial intelligence purposes, and in particular to represent what used to be called semantic networks, what's often called nowadays ontologies, and I'll be talking about that more later on in the semester. And here's a figure from the textbook that kind of gives you a little picture of the difference of those. I encourage you to please read the textbook in order to get a little bit more feeling for what NoSQL databases are about. And there's also discussion of the different comparison of these things. These examples that are shown here are all open source, completely free technologies for key value or document store or whatever. MongoDB is the one that you'll often hear about having to do with document store. And DynamoDB, which is what we're going to be using, this AWS product that we're going to be using, service I should say, is kind of a takeoff on MongoDB. So what we're going to do in our Python project is we're actually going to create an AWS database. We're going to read JSON data just like you did before. And when we did the visualization exercises, we read this JSON data and we created visualizations from it. But this time we're going to be doing a little bit more with it. We're going to learn how to do queries in a document store environment, and we're going to be able to generate JSON data to send to a D3 visualization and then ultimately display the visualization. So this kind of gives you a little picture of the process. So we already had the AdventureWorks database, relational database. I've actually provided for you the Java program that builds the bill of materials JSON file. So in case you're interested in seeing how I did that, you can try it yourself. Of course, you have to have a connection to AdventureWorks, and you can run it, and there's a query. The query is the database, and also does some recursion, because we have to build a hierarchy, and as we'll see, building hierarchies of data requires something called recursion, which you really probably didn't learn about, at least in our programming classes, but we're going to do a little bit of recursion in this exercise as well. And then here are 3 different little Python scripts that we are going to be creating throughout our exercise. And throughout this whole time, what you're going to be doing is basically interacting with AWS through your credentials. And specifically, you're going to be using the DynamoDB resource and database throughout this exercise that we're going to do. I figure if we were holding this in class and face-to-face, this would probably be something we'd be doing together over 2 time periods, 2 class periods. So I figure over the next week, you're going to be doing that, and I'll be giving you some videos to guide you through it. Making a lot of use of lists and dictionaries. So you learned a little bit about Python dictionaries before. Here's a link to that. And of course, you knew about Python lists as well. There's also other interesting Python data structures called tuples and sets, and you can read about these from these links here. So DynamoDB is a document store database. It's part of AWS's free tier. It's always free, so there's no limits. I'm trying to make use of as much free cloud-based services for the remainder of this semester as I can. We'll hopefully be doing some other stuff with AWS as well. But for now, we're going to be making use of DynamoDB. This link will tell you all the things that are free on AWS. It really is a great opportunity to learn about what's happening in the cloud-based services world, and I think it's good for you to get that kind of experience. A little bit more. Here's another link. All of these are in the notes that I've provided for you. So the things that you did already was hopefully you have created your AWS account. You've created an account, and also hopefully you created a sub account using identity and access management. You don't want your root account to be doing a lot of things. And then the permissions policy and attaching the permissions policy to this IAM user, and then the access keys and the secret access keys. And you have here, this is a JSON of the permission policy that you're going to be doing. And then I also had some configuration files that I provided for you. Let me go back to the modules. And in the modules, I had these credential files that were in a zip. I'm going to just go ahead and download them. And you can take a look and see. This is going to be a file that has to go into your user folder. This is the config. You just keep it as is, but this configuration file, you're just going to keep it exactly as is. And then the other file, you need to put in your own AWS access key and the secret access key, which you can get from AWS. And there's instructions on how to do that in the PowerPoints. I can see that a few of you have already done that. We could be using the command line interface, but we don't really need to because I've given you the files. So this slide is unnecessary. And then in terms of using DynamoDB, we have to install this package called Boto3, and that's going to allow us to use a bunch of AWS services, not just DynamoDB, and import that package. And I already went through the process of showing you how to do those things. Okay, so that's basically the introduction. We will go further and actually do some coding, and I will be doing some coding to help guide you through this. But for now, I think I'm done with this. Please keep active with your tasks in this class, as well as the other classes that you have. You're hopefully going to be working on reading that Facebook story and maybe using my story analyzer dashboards to help you navigate through it, and I look forward to a lively discussion on that over the next week or so. And in the meantime, I'll be making some more videos having to do with this exercise. So I'm going to stop for now.